The question was how or if the application setback maps would be a requirement element of the plan. And I think the answer is yes, because I think it's going to be valuable for the farmer to have a clear visual of the farm as the application setbacks apply, as well as the remaining acres or the affected acres that are in the setback areas, as well as the remaining areas that are in the I'll call the tilled portion of the land. In other words, if there are portions that are not cropped versus portions that are cropped, I think those delineations are going to be important. The measurements or the quantification of those is going to be really critical in terms of understanding planned acres, crop acres, and related nutrient recommendations in the planning process. And then finally, as MDA then comes out to evaluate implementation, I think that map's going to be an important tool to understand what the interpretation of the landscape was and how the plan was written around that interpretation. So we're going to be interested in understanding how those determinations were made, and then what information was given to the farmer in terms of how he'd manage that land. I'm thinking, but the question is how farm ponds are treated with respect to application setbacks. Is that your question, John? I believe that they are in, because I believe generally they were referred to as waters of the state. The things that were exempted were specific in terms of the ditches and ephemeral streams. So ponds didn't fall within those exemption definitions and thereby are in. Down front. Yes?
Some ponds have streams running in and out of them.
Right.
Some ponds don't.
Right.
Are they going to be treated the same then?
Yes.
Okay.
And the water courses feeding or leading away from will be treated accordingly based on how they fall in the definition. The question was, what did I really mean when I said animal density in reference to alternative BMPs? I listed out, I itemized a number of what I called considerations that the Conservation District might look at in terms of considering whether fencing was a requirement or not. So without specific criteria, without having specific criteria defined, one cow or one horse, in 10 acres means something very different than 15 or 20. So I think that type of comparison could be a consideration, but admittedly not having any specific criteria built around that. So I think generally we're going to be relying on the technical expertise of the conservation districts to try to make those evaluations, and are going to further define those kinds of considerations. And you had a part B. Okay, so there's about 3 questions in there, I think. First of all, the expertise that's going to be applied is would not come from a neighboring county. I mean, your example of HEL determinations having to be done by staff from a neighboring district, that requirement would not apply. I want to rely on the individual expertise and planners who are working in that county or conservation district to provide that kind of evaluation, because in many cases they already have existing knowledge and relationship with those farms and have a general understanding of those operations. So I think those are the best people to be doing those evaluations. In terms of who's going to make the contact, it could either be the farmer in pursuing his plan, whether obviously if he has pastures and he wants to make that contact with the conservation district, that's an option. That contact could also be routed or come from the advisor, the plan writer, as the individual who is going to seek that kind of technical determination from the district regarding that particular operation. And then the third part of that was, will the certification provided by the district stand up to scrutiny of those that may be looking over our shoulders? And I'm going to argue that yes, it will. I mean, we're going to structure that certification in a way that has the meaning and value for which it was intended. When that was written into the regulation, it was written in there recognizing that technical expertise to make those kinds of evaluation resides first, best, and last, in my mind, within that conservation district. So that's where that expertise lies, and we're going to rely on that capacity to make those kinds of evaluations and determinations. Yes, Terry? The question was, does the setback apply to less than 8 animal units? If the 8 animal unit criteria is the only means by which that individual is required to have a plan, then no. But if there's still, if there's less than 8 animal units and they have $2,500 of income or more, thereby requiring the plan, then yes, would apply. Does that answer your question, Terry? Yes. Okay. So if the plan's required, then yes, it would apply under, setbacks would apply under 8 animal units. Brian? Yes. Yes, if a plan's required, setbacks apply. Setback requirements apply as we've described. We can look at that further. I mean, I answered the question broadly as it's written. So your point generally is that there's nothing leaving the pond, then the setback should not apply. Is that what I'm interpreting? It's hard. As we make these kinds of determinations and rulemaking, it gets hard or challenging in one respect to start splitting out, defining ponds for different purposes, and so we can be more effective if we apply more and do that more generally and consistently. So, you could argue it that if there's any drainage area to the pond, that you're providing that setback as a means by which to protect water quality in that pond in general. John? Yes, and yes. And what you'll see, and when you look at that table that was a handout, was where you have a channelized stream in a floodplain soil mapping unit. So the floodplain soil mapping unit is then the trigger for that application setback, because it recognizes topography in general and the soils that are associated with those floodplains, and interprets or applies the requirement to have that setback because of that floodplain nature and potential or likelihood of inundation, if you will. So yes, I think the floodplain is considered by virtue of the floodplain mapping unit. The question is, will MDA be looking for PMT calculations when we do an implementation review related to 2014? From a regulatory point of view, no. And this is a tremendous opportunity or segue that I wanted to plug what I believe is both the value and the need that MDA has for this type of information. So while the proposal that we withdrew had an element, a reporting element in related to running both tools and providing MDA information. Because that proposal was pulled, that particular requirement will not be in place for 2014. Having said that, I would ask that you A, run those calculations, and B, utilize some of the tools that Tricia's provided to provide us that information. And I recognize that as a workload issue, but I hope you recognize that our ability to do our job, to do the best job possible in terms of having a most accurate and informed decision-making process to implement this new tool is going to be based on that kind of information. So you are in a tremendous opportunity to inform our process. So I'm going to ask that.
And wouldn't inform their clients.
Well, yeah. Well, as Trish says, and inform your clients, because the sooner your clients are aware of those needs, the more time they have to know what that ultimate effect will be. We'll talk about the schedule and how long it takes to get there, but knowing it sooner rather than later, I think, is a service that you can provide your clients. So with respect to sharing information, I don't want to know, I don't need to know whose farm it is. I'd be interested to know what county it's in, but I don't need that farm-specific information. I'd be curious to know the county in which that field is located, the acres that are associated with that analysis. But I don't want, I'm extremely, listen, if somebody's been in court for 7 years on confidentiality, I don't need to go down that path with this particular request. So I'm sensitive to privacy. Oh, I understand.
Can I weigh in for a second?
Yeah, Josh?
I'm going to weigh in here for a second because I don't have to. I'm not criticizing when I say this, but I don't have to be as careful as Roy. And if he says something, it'll be in the newspaper that MDA said. If it's in the newspaper that McGrath said, no one really cares, right? So,
Oh, I wouldn't say that.
well, let me put it this way: McGrath doesn't care. So, I mean, the deal is this: if I'm a farmer, I'd already have run the PMT on every single field I'm going to apply manure to or have applied manure to, because I want to know what's coming. And while they're saying, oh, I'm not sure, this is going to happen. You live in the state of Maryland. You've seen what's happened here over the last 20 years. There is going to be more restrictive phosphorus management in the state of Maryland. No way around it. This is only a temporary delay. The forces that want to see this go through, they want to see a soil test P limit, right? And this is being recorded. This is no secret. The majority of people believe that phosphorus manure application should be cut off at 75 FIV. The majority of voters in the state of Maryland. It's a democracy. So the PMT, while more restrictive, is an option that gives you management options. And if I'm a farmer, I want to know what it's going to do to my operation and what I'm going to have to do in the future. And if I'm a farmer, my advisor's not running this for me, so I know what's going to happen to me next year or the year after, I'm going to find a different advisor. That's advice I give farmers. I want to know what's coming. And if you don't, you're probably foolish.
I think everybody's very sensitive to the idea that folks don't want information released about their individual farm, but unless you're a very small business and only planning for 2 or 3 people, the fact is if you've got a reasonable client base and you just give a summary per county, these many acres, this much manure before, this much manure after, it'd be very useful to MDA, and it won't out anybody for their individual behavior. So I think I think there's a practical way to provide useful information without giving specific information about anybody and any field.
Yeah, I mean, as far as helping MDA, that's very accurate too. I mean, my focus is on the farmers, but it'll help with the process if we know what's coming from the state perspective, from Reuters' perspective as well, from the regulatory side. I mean, because I think what they'll be presenting, if anyone's concerned, it's like the numbers I presented. 9,700 farms. This is the percentage breakdown. That's the kind of stuff. And it gives you an indication of how this works, if we're going in the right direction or the wrong direction. That's correct. That's the way the recommendations work. The recommendations account for soil attenuation. The soil test recommendations, the FIV, that response curve that I showed in my presentation of soil test versus potential yield response, that accounts for that soil attenuation. So if the recommendation, according to University of Maryland soil testing procedures, is for 50 pounds of phosphate, then what we mean is we intend for, about 7.5 pounds to get into that crop. So that's the recommendation accounts for all of those things.
So you have phosphorus building potential using commercial fertilizer recommendations?
That's correct, but nowhere near to the expectation that we would see with manure. Because first of all, fertilizer is going to be somewhat more available depending on how you apply it. If you do a band application, a starter, so on and so forth. And if you have that kind of soil absorption capacity, you're not going to see it in the Mehlich 3 test. Remember, this gets into a whole different thing of intro soil phosphorus 101, but Mehlich 3 is not extracting total phosphorus, and it's not extracting plain available phosphorus. It's extracting very discrete pools, and then basically we're modeling the potential plain available phosphorus in that year from that soil test phosphorus. So it's not a number of the total amount of phosphorus, but you do have the potential. But when it all comes out in the wash, we don't see it. It takes a long time to build up soil P, and it takes a long time to draw it down. We've got a study going now that we stopped applying manure phosphorus in 1997, and the ones that were up around 500 FIV have not changed markedly. They haven't come down since 1997, and that's with annual cropping. So we don't see it going up, we don't see it going down. It's these other pools that Mehlich 3 doesn't measure are bleeding into that Mehlich 3 pool. You got this much phosphorus in the soil, you're measuring this much with Mehlich 3, and these other pools are just backfilling it as you take it out with the plant. There's a lot of processes. It's complicated. There's a lot of stuff happening in the soil.
I got Eddie in the back and then John.
So what's the cost of the phosphorus management tool is the question? And then there's a question about soil health, how it impacts soil health. So there's a couple things. Okay, the first thing I'll say is, even my short stature, I'm tired of bending over. Okay, so let me go to soil health. I'm not sure where all this comes in is soil health, and I'm not sure. Soil health. I'm not sure the soil health really factors into this, right? I mean, the phosphorus management tool is very site-specific and predicts relative risk for phosphorus transport. And then you have management options that you get to make the decision whether or not you're going to adopt them. And then, you know, as far as transport, I think that the things we think will interrupt transport are in the phosphorus management tool. Now, deep ripping buffer strips to decrease subsurface transport, that's something that has been researched. And that's something that in future iterations, I just don't think, you know, this is, it's easier said than done. It costs millions and millions and millions of dollars to do this kind of research. So that's why some of these things aren't in there yet, like the deep ripping of the buffer zones. But that does mix high P and low P soils and decreases the potential for soluble phosphorus running off. Obviously, that works against soil health, I think, is this massive soil disturbance works against soil health. So, you know, but I think those options are in there. The phosphorus filters that we've been doing research on, I've been doing research on for years. A lot of people have adding phosphorus sorting materials. These things will be continue to be added as we have the data that we think justifies their inclusion to reduce your score. Now, that's a whole separate question from the question of what's the cost to the farmer. I have no idea. I mean, it depends on the farmer. Is he taking biosolids? Is he, you know, that's what a lot of P indexes are run for biosolids. Is it dairy manure generated on the farm? Is it, you know, beef manure? Is it poultry litter, layer manure? All these things are going to factor in that cost. Is it self-generated poultry manure? What's the cost of transporting that? What's the closest receiving? I think these things are going to be extremely difficult. There's no question there's a cost if it's locally generated manure on that farm, or if they've been getting that manure for free. They've been getting basically a free nitrogen source, and now another farmer's going to get a free nitrogen source. So some of this question, I mean, I sympathize to some extent, but some people are like, well, this is going to destroy all these farmers that are going to have to buy nitrogen. Well, you're going to be replacing nitrogen on someone else, so someone's benefiting. It's not all negative. The guy that gets that manure now because he has a low P index score, he benefits. So it's not all negative. Some people are going to be happy because they're going to be able to get poultry litter and they couldn't before. So these questions are complex, and I don't think that there's a broad brush answer that can kind of just, it's complicated.
Lloyd, I am addressing this to you.
Okay.
With regards to Josh's comment about phosphorus levels staying relatively steady in the soil even after phosphorus addition has been taken away, I'm dealing currently with an MDE permit that has discussions of nutrient management plans in it as a requirement. And one of those requirements is that if the phosphorus levels do not come down based on the cropping and nutrient management plan, then I need to present to MDE an alternative plan to further reduce that phosphorus in that field. And if I cannot do that on a natural basis through the plan, what are my alternatives? I think there needs to be a discussion with regards to the science of phosphorus with the other regulatory agency, MDE, as it is with MDA, and kind of let one meet with the other.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment, number one. And to respond generally, if you look in the PMT itself, there are examples of management practices that are available to attenuate or reduce that risk. So I think those kinds of things.
Not risk, reduce the phosphorus.
Okay. So depending on where you are in the scale, I've argued that not applying any additional P is, you know, a pretty good start. So if that's, if that option's available in the plan.
If I don't apply P, I may not reduce the phosphorus in that soil column, even if I don't, because the saturated nature of the soil is such that it will not come down until there's eons and eons passes.
So that's a conversation I think we need to have with MDE to make
Yes.
sure that we're clear on those opportunities, how real those opportunities are.
Absolutely.
And articulating them so people have a good understanding of them.
Well, just let me say that there are some knowledge gaps across agencies, and that's about as diplomatic as I can say it. If you look at the data about P drawdown, and it starts with McCollum's data that was published from North Carolina years ago, where he started out at about roughly FIV at 200 on our scale, and in 15 years he got it down to I think 60 or 70, with intensive cropping. Bob Cradaville and Dr. Cole have the study that Josh has taken over, and again, it's a very, very slow drawdown. In the first several years, first 5, 7, 10, it bounces around, but you'd have a hard time seeing any reduction in the slope. Though that's the reality of the situation, and if there's someone at MDA that thinks that because there's 200 FIV there and you take out 40, it should go down to 160, they need to be informed. And I think MDE needs to be, excuse me, I beg your pardon. They need to be informed, and they can talk to me or they can talk to Dr. McGrath. I can't guarantee that they'll listen to you. I mean, I've spent time talking with them about other issues too, and they seem to be set in their ways. But it's a scientific issue. It appears, if what you're saying is true, that they're expecting unreasonable responses, and we would certainly be glad to provide some information for you to justify the fact that in 2 or 3 years, you're not going to see any measurable change. We don't need to change the regulations for them. We need to inform them.
Let me
Go ahead.
address that
Go
because
ahead.
this is something I'd rather talk about. The actual science of things is more fun. But I mean, so here's your options. I mean, I'm like, I don't know how you regulate. What do they do? Like ban you from farming if your soil test P doesn't come down?
They don't allow you to put your wastewater effluent on that property.
Right. Which I mean, so over time it will draw down if you're not allowed to apply that effluent, right? I mean, because that's the first thing is the fundamental building block of nutrient management plan is phosphorus balance. And when we get in a situation where we're out of compliance, if you will, have high P soils, it's because you were applying more than you were removing. And this happened over a long time to push it up. And what we see is in the first 2 years after you cease application of manure, you see this dramatic drop. And that's over 2 years soil sorption occurring. And then you see it level off. So you have these very soluble components that are extractable by malic-free, which probably only represents maybe 20% of all the P that's actually in the soil is being taken out by malic-free. If I had to demonstrate drawdown, there are some options that would reduce the measurable if malic-free is the indicator they're using. Because again, you're not decreasing soil phosphorus, you're decreasing malic-free extractable phosphorus. If that's the indicator they're using, and that's an important differentiation. And there are things you can do to make phosphorus less extractable by malic-free. One would be deep tillage to incorporate low P soils, because you typically have stratification with phosphorus in the top 1 to 2 inches. So that would be one option. 2 is cropping, very long-term kind of thing there. Or there are soil amendments that decrease phosphorus solubility that we talked about, like gypsum. Other than that, it's a very long-term process. But that would those would decrease extractable phosphorus if it was some sort of regulatory requirement out of another agency.
No, the question was, are we facing MDE as a higher authority in this issue? That question was asked in the context of an NPDES permit. It was a permit situation, and the plan that was required as a result of that permit was begging these questions. So that was MDE's role in this particular example.
But that does not exclude them from being educated on the subject.
Well, and to just expand a bit, I agree, John. And to expand further, I mean, NRCS, as they've redrafted their 590 standards and recommendations, I mean, they're asking all the states to look at, update their 590 standards, and they're looking at drawdown practices. I mean, they're actually making recommendations for consideration of those drawdowns. When we drafted, it was round 3. There were environmental interests that wanted us to require drawdown practices when the risk category was high. I was able to resist that. So that we actually had language that recommended that the farmer may consider drawdown practices, but it wasn't a requirement.
Let me see if I got this. You're asking about the setback distance relative to what Royden described for setbacks.
No, I'm talking about in your PMT software, you put in there you only have time 30 pounds of starter,
Okay.
of P.
Uh-huh.
And if your distance is 300 feet from water, it possibly still puts you in a high category. You're not putting out, 10 tons of manure.
Right.
So I'm asking you, does it give any less restrictions?
So, okay. So, when you talk about the interpretive category, low, medium, and high, and the only phosphorus input I'm going to have on the field is I've got a soil test P of 500, so I have to run the PMT. And I wasn't planning on applying manure. I'm going to put 30 pounds of starter phosphorus out there because I like to waste money. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And it comes back high and says no P applied because it's high. My assumption is it's high, no P applied, right? I mean, that's kind of a regulatory.
Calculations, and that's what it's-
Our recommendation is if you score high, your phosphorus. Now, I would think if you're putting in a starter, I'd be shocked if it came back as high, because you've
He's
seen.
asking the question because he's seen it,
It-
and I've seen it in some plans I've looked at.
Okay, so I mean, this is the boogaboo with accuracy, right? I mean, because if you're no-tilling, your Russell, what's your Russell score? Because it's site specific. So what's the Russell score on this field?
Well, I can't cite that right now, but I know it comes, I know
Eight.
in the PSI is low, and now in the PMT, it can fall into anywhere from the medium to high.
So you've got to control for whatever the risk category is. So that's why it's segmented into components. I would imagine, I'm guessing sediment. That's Russell, right? Because if you have starter injected, your surface runoff risk would be almost zero.
Right, he's putting right in the road.
Yeah, your subsurface, I'm guessing, is probably zero. So I'm guessing you're running a really high Russell, and your soil test P was already really high. So
Well,
it's
well,
not the fertilizer that's caused. If you look at the components of the index, that's what you got to look at. What component of the index is pushing you high? And then if you want to apply that starter, you got to figure out how to manage around that. It's the carrot and the stick kind of theory of the PMT.
Right, but what do you call high? I mean, in the FIV, I know over 100 is excessive, over 150.
I don't
Is 300?
care what your FIV is. I don't think
Well,
any of it's
what-
high. It's all relative. I'm saying that if your risk is coming back high on the PMT, that's an easy calculation. It's Russell, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and above 4, we figure it's all the same because actually most of your phosphorus is lost in the first half ton of sediment, right? And then it's just Russell times soil test P. It's pretty straightforward calculation. So that cutoff is going to occur at different soil test P's for different Russells. So if my Russell is above 4, then it's 4 times whatever that soil test P is times 2, right? You've got the calculation there in your hand.
But I think,
No, it's not multiplied by 2 anymore.
Oh, no 2 anymore. So if the cutoff's 100, then that means 4 times 25. So you got to get your Russell down.
no, I think, in my
Times 0.1.
opinion, and I'm not just squaring your opinions, that the distance is way too much. I mean, if you have a person that has 175 FIV, okay, we run the test, and he comes back from a PSI low and comes back and falls in the high category.
You're looking at the wrong factor here. You're looking at distance. Distance can only lower your score. It can't increase your score. All right, so-
No, but what I'm trying to say here is, before it was up to anything over 100, most time you put out. Now you have to be over 500 feet, okay? So I'm saying I have a field here, and I got a stream there, it's 300 feet away. How's commercial fertilizer put in a row gonna get to that 300 feet?
Again, I'd have to look at it. I'd say it
Well,
will not.
I couldn't,
Absolutely will not.
Right.
Absolutely will not. That's
Well-
not what we're talking about. That's why I say you got to look at the components. My guess is it's the sediment that's getting in that stream, right? It's the Russell that's driving that score, is my guess. I mean, and comparing it to the PSI is kind of a null and void argument because when I was 16, I could buy cigarettes and I didn't have to buckle my seatbelt. But you can't do that anymore. Life changes, everything moves on. But I mean, I'm saying you got to look at the components and see what the individual risk factor was. I imagine it's sediment. I don't know without looking at the specific field. It's not the fertilizer and it's not the distance that's your risk. It was probably the
Oh,
sediment component of that
well-
score.
Well, if you change the distance in PMT, let's say it's 300 in a high, change the distance to 500, and fall back into the low, no medium.
That's the way that contributing zone works.
Well, okay, I understand it, and what I'm saying, don't you think, or do you think, I think, let's put it my way, I think it should be a less restriction on a person that's putting a 30-pound starter out there for his pop-up fertilizer than a person putting out 10 tons of poultry litter.
And
on the
there absolutely is, because if that person gets their Russell down below 1, my guess is they can put the 30 pounds out and the manure guy still can't on the same field. So there is less restriction on that fertilizer guy. Have you tried running that whole equation lowering your Russell and see if the score comes back into low, and then run the whole equation with manure, and instead of sitting here and just discussing. Yes, Paul. That's right. Times 0.1. Times 0.1, and then with your management factors, right? Yeah, and that's because still the old traditional knowledge, control your sediment, you control your phosphorus loss. And actually, there was a huge argument about this. You know how it scales so that you get, it goes 1, 2, 3, 4 tons per acre, and then above 4 tons per acre? I mean, Dr. Steinhill was there when we talked about this 3 years ago, and we said, well, really, all of your phosphorus was lost in the first ton. All right, because phosphorus preferentially sorbs to the fine particles. And so if your erosion is a half ton in Russell, you're in bad shape regards to phosphorus. But we said we can't really manage that, and the point of the PMT is to encourage better management. And 1 is better than 2, 2 is better than 3, 3 is better than 4. So we tried to scale it to T, which has nothing to do with phosphorus loss, but generally T is 4 to 7 in Maryland, 5. And so we said, at least we'll be getting people to put soil conservation practices in place to try and get that score lower. Even though they're still losing a ton of phosphorus through that sediment loss. It's sediment that's a driver, and sediment is intentionally weighted very high because we do know still that is the most, we've lost focus on it because of all the new knowledge about dissolved P transport that has come up in the last 20 years, but back to 1970 science, sediment is still really important in this whole deal, and that's why it's weighted so heavily. Yeah, so when we first started down this idea of redesigning the PMT, you know, the old one was kind of, you just use your straight Russell. And with Russell, it actually wasn't that much of a conversation. And there's two kinds of models, if you will, or p-indexes. There's a continuous variable, which is like 0, 0.1, 0.2. And then there's categorical, where everything from 0 to 1 is worth 2, everything from 1 to 2 is worth 4, so on and so forth, right, or however it goes. And we discussed making it a continuous variable versus a categorical variable. In the end, we went with categorical because it was easier to kind of map it out and see what the impact would be and kind of lump people together, but actually probably a more precise is, you know, the real world operates in gradients, is to use a continuous variable. My assumption is that p-index version 4 will use all continuous variables. But it's difficult to, in the old one, some of the modelers that worked with us on this said your old PSI is weak because you use continuous and categorical variables. And we need you to have a more solid model use all continuous or all categorical. And so we went to all categorical because, again, this is a sledgehammer. This isn't a finishing hammer. This is a coarse tool for a coarse low, medium, and high. Isn't real. We're not slicing it up real fine here. And so categorical is more coarse. It's a blunt instrument. It's not a scalpel. You know what I mean? Whereas models are that scalpel. They're more fine, more higher resolution. They use all continuous variables. We're moving more towards that modeled approach and using continuous variables in the long term. But at this point, we just went with the categorical because that was kind of the limit of our understanding of phosphorus movement. I mean, I don't mean to shortchange what you're saying. You're absolutely right that 30 pounds of starter phosphorus in the row, that fertilizer is not the risk. Something else is the risk. Probably the soil test P or the Russell. I mean, if you're saying it's not the Russell, it's the soil test P. Because there's plenty that come out low with 30 pounds of phosphorus. There's plenty that come out low with 4 tons of manure. So it just depends on all those factors combined. There's a lot in that mix. It's hard to pick out that one thing.
And to follow up with what I'm saying, my experience with the PMT on the water distance really drives the control of the low, medium, high. So I guess another question is, if I have a field, all right, and before I get off that field, I got a buffer of 35 feet, okay, and then I got 100 feet of woods, okay, so now I'm only about 200 feet to the water source. Well, 9 out of 10 times that's going to fall you into the medium or too high. I'm still talking about commercial fertilizer. How can I justify to telling my clients that pop-up 30 pounds fertilizer will get to that stream? You don't have the answer.
Oh, I got an answer. You can tell them, tough luck. This is the way it is. I mean, that's the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it stinks for them.
Well, I guess I'm
You'll
not-
probably be saving them some money.
Well,
Yeah, but let's listen to what Josh just said, though.
Okay.
He's not saying that the 30 pounds of phosphorus this guy's applying this year is getting to the stream. He's saying that phosphorus is getting to the stream in one form or another, and because of that, no more can be added. Couch it in those terms, because that's what he just said several times.
mm-hmm.
We don't want to add any more, the situation given what it is. And yeah, I've looked at a couple, well, probably 800 or 900 situations now of 2012 plans where I'm running it through PMT. And there's a lot of people that used starter only that aren't going to be able to use it with the PMT. That's what I'm finding. That's what you're finding.
Right.
I mean, let's get away from PMT and environmental. Let's talk agronomic. There's been a lot of talk about this thing right here in the press, and I've talked to farmers about it and all of that. But if your soil test is over 100 FIV, the best science, again, I talk about this with variable rate nitrogen all the time. If you're going to say we're going to go with the science, we got to go with all the science. And the environmental and the ag groups have both been guilty of this. When I talk about variable rate nitrogen, the environmental groups love it when I talk about cutting nitrogen fertilizer, but they hate it when I say you're going to apply more than our current recommendations. And that happens. And if you're going to go with one side of that graph, you got to go with the other side. And the best science indicates that you have an extremely low, not impossible, our job as scientists is to describe uncertainty, but you have an extremely low probability of yield response to starter phosphorus fertilizer. You will get an early growth response. I see it all the time, but you will not collect a return on that investment. If your soil test is over 150, I would pretty much bet everything I got, which is a 2006 Pontiac Vibe with 120,000 miles on it, if you're wondering, that you're not going to get any yield response to that starter fertilizer. You will get an early growth response, but you will not get a yield response in the yield bin in corn or wheat. It's just fact of the matter, especially if you have a history of applying manure. That's the beauty of manure. We see extreme yield benefits from manure many years after application because it's got phosphorus stored in pools that Mallee 3 is not measuring that's bleeding into that system. So, in the long run, they're going to suffer an economic loss from transporting manure. But if you're only talking about cutting off their starter fertilizer, I know a lot of people have trouble wrapping their mind around this because it's what we've always done. And we do see a beautiful green stand of corn versus that kind of weak early phosphorus deficiency from cold soils, and we don't have good diffusion. You do get a big biomass response to starter, but you don't get an economic return. That's why these recommendations are such. If you're up here, you're not getting money back on that fertilizer. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is exactly what Dr. Steinhilber said. We're trying to approach a nutrient balance in high-risk fields. And so while the fertilizer phosphorus is not being transported, the fertilizer phosphorus is replacing phosphorus that the crop is taking up and keeping that soil phosphorus high so that the risk persists. And so the reason that the interpretation of PMT is set the way it is to cut that application so that you do come into balance over that long term, 100 years, 200 years, 10 years, maybe. I mean, it depends on the site. So those are the justifications. It's not the fertilizer phosphorus that necessarily is transported.
And I understand that the belief that starter fertilizer for corn and many other crops is deeply ingrained in people's psyche. It's a strongly held belief, even though person after person has shown that 9 years out of 10, you don't make any money on it, And when you look at what you pay over time and what you don't get in yield, it isn't worth it financially. It's hard to get people to understand that because you are dealing with a belief system. I believe I need starter on corn. All right, I understand all that. But all you can do as a planner is give the information in sync with the recommendations and the regulations. And as I like to say, and I don't know if I've ever said this in front of Royden, but it's between the farmer god and MDA.
Yeah, I think I've heard that.
Well, thank you.
Josh, how does the degree of peat saturation, like in his example, play into that?
How does degree of P saturation play into that example of starter P and blah, blah, blah? Again, the starter P is it doesn't matter the source. There's this, I gotta learn not to pick the microphone up.
Regardless of starters, what influence does the treat?
Honestly, it might be weighted a little more heavier than it should be in the current version. Again, you know, it's just different than regulatory. This is the science, and the job of scientists is to describe uncertainty, right? But the DPS, typical threshold values of about 40%. So luckily, I can move just right to this slide. So phosphorus loss, let's picture this as being degree of phosphorus saturation, or excuse me, degree of phosphorus saturation and risk. Just straightforward. We take all the transport variables out, and we've got columns of soil, and we're dropping water on top, and we're looking for water leaching out the bottom. What's the phosphorus concentration? There have been millions of studies published on this. Basically, somewhere around 20 to 40, there's a change point where that line of risk stays really flat, really low. Risk is low. And then when we get to 40, risk goes and rapidly goes up. So it's like no risk, no risk. So from 0 to 40, it doesn't matter. You have the same risk and it's really low. And at 40% saturation, all of a sudden, there's a change point where phosphorus starts leaking out of this thing. Either it's dissolved P in runoff or dissolved P in the leachate. So 40% is roughly the target. Our index is scaled on a scale of kind of 0 to 10, right? When we look at all the transport factors, remember I said that earlier? So that's why we multiply DPS by 2, so that 40 would actually have a value of 80, which is roughly what the whole deal is scaled around. So if you just look at that single factor of DPS, 40 is where we figure the risk goes way up. Interesting thing is, on some really highly saturated soils, I didn't know this was possible until we started going down this route. And I got some of the soil testing labs to just give me tens of thousands of soil samples, just what was the phosphorus, iron, and aluminum, so we know what the landscape looks like. There is actually phosphorus saturation out there over 100%, which is most of the ones I'd ever measured in my research were well below that. So there are ones out there that are just really high, like 120%. You know, you're going to have to do a whole lot on the transport side to get your P score down to lower medium. If your DPS is up there at 40 to 60-ish, you're going to have everything else tightened up. You're going to have to be injecting low Russell, whatever.
And I don't know if you know, but how common would that be? Not very common, I'm assuming.
Depends on where you're at. West of the Chesapeake Bay, I wouldn't see this as an issue. You got more.
P levels or because of soil type?
Both. Malic-free phosphorus. So phosphorus, you have a higher phosphorus buffer capacity in high clay soils. So if I have 10 pounds of phosphorus in a soil, and that soil is a clay soil, the Malic-free might be 75, and I have 10 pounds of phosphorus in a sandy soil. These numbers are completely fictional. You just realize it's being recorded. But we got 10 fingers, so 10's easy for us to handle. 10 pounds in a clay soil, Malic-free might be 50 FIV, and 10 pounds of phosphorus in a sandy soil might be 100 FIV. So the Malic-free phosphorus is more extractable on on coarse texture soils, and over here, fine texture soils have more iron and aluminum, and DPS is the amount of phosphorus divided by iron and aluminum. So the amount of extractable phosphorus is lower here, and there's more extractable iron and aluminum. So both things work in the favor. West of the bay, generally DPS, I think DPSs are going to be much lower. It's the sandy soils that have soil test phosphorus very high that have these high degrees of phosphorus saturation. No. Well, that would be unlikely. 500 FIV of 500. My guess is the DPS would be higher than that. I have to do some math in my head, which I'm not going to do. But the deal is the FIV affects your erosion score, and that's it in the new PMT. And DPS affects your soluble surface runoff and your soluble subsurface runoff. So your 500 is going to knock you out into the high category if your Russell is high. So right there, you're going to be shut down because of particulate P transport. Now, you manage the particulate and keep that low, then that 500 FIV has no impact on the dissolved P loss risk factors. Then the degree of phosphorus saturation is the only factor in those two. Joe?
On the saturation level, I understand it's important. Does it change over time? If so, what would change the saturation level?
So this is very interesting. We have some ongoing research on this, actually funded by the grain producers, the grain board, and this will be factored into future iterations of PMT. The degree of phosphorus saturation on those plots that we mentioned where we showed long-term soil P drawdown and Malic-free P is not necessarily coming down very fast, have some interesting things going on that we can't entirely put our finger on. And I think it's long-term kinetics of phosphorus absorption. So the first thing, let me give you a couple examples. Let's assume that the amount of phosphorus in that soil doesn't change, or doesn't change enough to really impact this equation. You're not changing the amount of iron and aluminum in your soil, okay, unless you're adding it somehow, which you shouldn't be really. And so generally, the only thing that's going to change is the phosphorus. But what we're seeing actually is we're seeing that it's a nonlinear relationship. So we're actually seeing DPS come down a little faster than just straight Mehlich-3 when we measure it by ammonium oxalate extraction, which is not what you do for p-index. We're estimating ammonium oxalate DPS, which is really the number we're after, but we're using an equation to get to it using Mehlich-3 phosphorus, iron, and aluminum. This research may indicate that in the future, someone may want to look at their ammonium oxalate, phosphorus, iron, and aluminum versus their Mehlich-3 and use that instead of using the estimation. But even the Mehlich-3 estimated one does seem to follow a slightly different trend on different soil types. It depends on the soil type. And I'm not sure I understand why, because mathematically it really shouldn't. But you're right, nothing is really changing. It's your Mehlich-3 extractable phosphorus, your Mehlich-3 extractable iron and aluminum, and you put that into the equation to predict ammonium oxalate extractable phosphorus, iron, and aluminum. So we're saving you a step. You don't have to have this extra expensive test done that's very expensive. So there's not a whole lot. Now, deep tillage, again, might impact this because we have much more iron and aluminum deeper. And you're taking an 8-inch soil sample to write your plan. Down there below 8 inches, you got a ton of iron and aluminum. If you were just really set that you want to decrease your, and so the environmentalists call this a loophole, you know, or so let's say the proponents of this, but it's not a loophole because you are actually decreasing. If sediment's not your problem, if erosion's not your problem, as it wouldn't be, I'm sure, on your fields, you are actually decreasing your risk of dissolved phosphorus loss by doing deep tillage and bringing high iron and aluminum soils to the surface and mixing them in with that phosphorus. So that's the only way that you can do from a management to decrease that DPS that I see, is coming through there and doing some deep tillage. But in the long run, the only other option, since your iron and aluminum basically are staying static, is to wait for that soil phosphorus to drop, which is so the DPS drops faster than just Mehlich-3 pH. And I'm not sure I understand why yet, but that's research that's ongoing.
Look, the PMT is just the second version of the PSI, and we had all these discussions when PSI came in a couple of years ago. We have a number of years ago. We have a whole bunch of frequently asked questions that address what is water, what isn't water. So my recommendation would be to first go back and look at those, because no one's going to reinvent the wheel. If it wasn't water for PSI, it isn't water for PMT. If it was water for PSI, it is water for PMT. Just remember that surface water and streams are not equal. Surface water is a broader concept than stream. All right, so go back and look at the FAQs on the website in terms of phosphorus. And you might want to print them out and tack them up on your wall like I do. Only I can hardly see my wall anymore for all the things I've tacked up.
And I would add to that, too, that one of the only thing that has changed, and the definition, Trish is absolutely right, has not changed, is whether or not you have to run that subsurface component is predicated on whether or not you have artificial drainage, such as a ditch. So that does sort of add a little complexity in here. And I said this at crop school down at Ocean City, and I sympathize with MDA. When the university's going at this, we're going at it from a common sense approach, believe it or not. That we're saying in intensively ditch drained fields, you have high potential for subsurface phosphorus transport. The way it's written right now, if you have a ditch in the field, you have to run that subsurface component. But there are ditches that aren't that picture I showed of subsurface loss, of intensive subsurface drainage. There are ditches in Kent County, Maryland, with a deep water table that don't meet those two descriptions of subsurface transport. And you would have to run the subsurface transport component by law because of the way we wrote the PMT, right? But the intention, and we've got to figure out a way, and maybe this delay will give us a little time to work with Royden because he's good at defining things, because I don't look at things from that regulatory standpoint. And when we wrote the PMT, we didn't look at it from that perception. But there are fields that will have to run the subsurface transport, and everyone's sitting there going, yeah, it's my field, it's my field. It's not most of your fields. But there are fields where that subsurface transport, there's a ditch there, but it's not happening. And then what I'm thinking of is really deep water table, deep well-drained soils, and just a surface collection ditch running through the field. And you know what those kind of, but right now, the way it's written, you're going to have to run the subsurface component. If we got it right, it should still come out low, but you shouldn't have to run it. So these are the kind of conversations that have been going on since 1992 and continue to go on. And so that's one question. It's still water. But it's a surface conduit, and how do we capture that? And you know, I've been working with some consultants, and any of you in the room, this again, not just supplying data from running both, but if you have recommendations, that thing right there that I just talked about, the ditches that make you run the subsurface, but we know they're not subsurface ditches, that was brought to me by a consultant. And now we're going to address it. We can't think of everything. I mean, I think of 99% of things, but there's 1% I didn't think of. And you might be bringing that. So always, you know, I'm always flippant and, you know, may act like I'm not paying attention to you, but we're digesting it. And you see more acres than I see. That's just a fact of the matter. And so if you have one of these deals, or you have a tricky way that we can capture that subsurface drain field, let me know. You know, and I think it's going to be something about slope and number of ditches, right? Because we're not talking about that one. We're talking about intensively drained fields. So anyway, we got to figure out a trickier way to grab that, but that's a definition of surface water. Well, most of the people that have brought that up too, they're like, I know this, you know, because we're so focused on overland flow. I mean, this is really a new development of that subsurface component to the ditches. It's very specific landscape. You know, and we say you don't have to run the subsurface component. You just assign a 0 to it if you don't have those ditches. And I wonder if the other way around this is, if you're running that subsurface component, you probably shouldn't have to run the 2 surface components. So in future iterations, I may throw that in there. That if we figure out a good way to identify those subsurface drain fields, and if I'm confident that 95% of the P in that field that moves off field is in a subsurface pathway, then you don't have to run 2 of the components. You just run the subsurface component. So that's another, but we got to figure out an accurate way to select those fields from the landscape. Say, these are the fields that we're going to just do subsurface on, and these are the fields we're going to do the 2 surface components on. Ultimately, that's what we should be doing. I'm not sure how the regulations address that. But from But from a management perspective, the problem is, what's the contributing area to that ditch? I mean, so from an environmental perspective, I'm not into coming up with loopholes to go around. I get accused of making I know. I get accused of that all the time. So if I tell you to write that out as a separate management unit, then that could be a loophole if that ditch is actually still draining the area where I'm applying manure. But if in fact you're not contributing to it from that field, then segregate it out. In reality, remember when I first started my talk, I said 5% of the landscape is assumed to be the critical source area. By critical source area, we mean the area contributing phosphorus to surface water. And that 5%, the scientists that say that, they don't mean 5% of the fields. They mean 5% of that field. We just don't have the technical capability yet to do a spatially variable p-index. But ultimately, in the long run, if we ever get, and we've had extensive talks with Royden about this, it's a question of, we don't have enough science yet to have a justified spatial p-index. And it'll be many years before we can do that. There's no doubt about it. But in the long run, that's what we're looking for, is picture a field and paint it in colors, green, yellow, and red. And the red is high, the yellow is medium, and the green is low. And then that farmer can make a decision about where to apply that phosphorus, because the green is assumed to not contribute to that stream, but the red is. Here, the easy example is that study that I showed from Pennsylvania. That one with the 3 different soil test Ps. And if we had used soil test P, we would have put in manure in the wrong place. That's a perfect area. If we had a variable, if that's all one field, if we had a spatial p-index, the spatial p-index would have said this low spot down here is your risk area. The other 2, if you got a daily haul manure, daily haul it there. That's the idea. But it's hard to get that in the regulation.
That's in my wheelhouse.
Yeah, that's right. Stay in your lane.
To the extent that you've got information to justify or split out that unique area of the field, and this came up in a grid sampling discussion, to the extent that you've got more intensive data that allows you to differentiate one part of the farm or the operation from another, and in your example, Howard, this 2-acre piece, then the remaining portion of the field, assuming it's not it's not over 150 and doesn't trigger the PMT, then that relative risk is not going to exist, just by virtue of that trigger, or certainly doesn't exist in the regulatory context.
Okay, first of all, I've had a long discussion with Jim Brewer a week or so ago about how far away from a ditch, how far into a field is the ditch intercepting the water, and is there a good, quick way we can even estimate it? And he said there are ways of doing it. They're not quick. They're not readily available right now. And the distance from a ditch that might, the distance from the ditch where the field might be contributing water to that ditch is going to depend upon the subsurface conditions, the soil texture, whatever, we could come up with a way based on soil map units, but again, it's not available now. It varies anything from 25 to 400 feet, depending upon your subsurface conditions and your soil texture, all right? Number one, and we really don't know, and there is no quick way for us to know now. Number two, if you were to cut that field in such a way so that the part closer to the ditch was management unit A and the rest was management unit B, you've now permanently created two management units, okay? And from then on, you're going to have to deal with them as two different management units or two different fields. And you've also got to look at the fact that that ditch may be the down gradient surface water. So the distance of water, unless you're really far away, is still going to kill you, right? If it's the down gradient water, you've got to get pretty far away before you don't get dinged pretty hard. So in the couple situations where people have sent me a map, I've looked at it and it hasn't done them any good to make two management units because you're still close enough to the surface water that it still puts you in a high category. That being the case, why make two different management units if you've already coalesced fields, you know?
So that brings up an interesting point, and I think Royden's dead on with tracking the science on this. From the soil test, if you do grid sampling soil test, in a ditch drain system where subsurface is killing you, we often see very high. A lot of the research they initiated, all this came out of this one farm at UMES, and they found that the average soil test P for the field was 350, but all the other fields that were a tenth of the amount of phosphorus loss were 350 too. And they said, what's going on here? They weren't applying anything. They got all these ditches, and they got one that's throwing 25 kilograms per hectare per year, and the rest are below 1. They found one area at the headwater of the ditch, about the size of this area of seats, that has soil tests of 3,400. Very common situation. And that was the contributing area. That was the critical source area. So that was a source issue. And as Royden said, if you had the data to document that, if source is your issue, I'd be on board with saying, this, block that out and don't apply any more to it because you've got a source problem here, transport being the same across all these sites. But when you get into transport, a lot of people don't realize this because we think hydrology's been around for so long. That's really the weakest part of the P-index, and we've always known this. All the scientists working on P-indexes, connection and transport is the hardest part to index. And so if you're talking about a transport issue and the source is the same across the field, it would be a lot more dubious to try and split that out because of the contributing area that Trish points out. And in a surface runoff, maybe you can make some arguments, you can assess some different things. If you're outside of that 500 feet and you have like that example of the Pennsylvania watershed, that's a little more clear cut. But mostly these transport components, it would be difficult to make that argument in a ditch drain system. Maybe in a stream-based surface runoff situation you could. But that's why we don't have a spatially variable P-index, because we can't spatially calculate Russell yet, because there is sources and sinks of sediment within the field, and Russell is designed to give you that number for the edge of the field, and it integrates across the whole field. To be able to map the sources and sinks within the field, we don't have the technical capability to do that yet.